Hello everyone, welcome or welcome back to my channel. I'm Greer and it's lovely to have you here with me today. So I've talked a bit on this channel about how important reading is to me. Over the years, I've definitely seen my reading tastes grow and change, and overall I have a better sense of who I am as a reader. I think that there's some habits that have definitely helped me to sustain that even through the slumps, and trust me when I say there have been slumps. So today I wanted to chat with you about some of those habits in the hopes that they will be as useful for you as they have been for me. So getting right into it, I wanted to start off by talking about setting aside time for reading, having designated times during the day for reading. I think one of the most common excuses that people have for not reading as much as they want to is, I'm too busy, I don't have time. And I speak from experience when I say that. We all have responsibilities, work, school, families to take care of, and sometimes life just gets in the way. Sadly, we no longer have the same luxuries that we did as children, where the only thing that we maybe had to worry about was whether a book was going to be available for us at the library or whether our parents would catch us reading under the bed sheets after bedtime. But I think that ultimately we make time for the things that we want to do. Now, I'm not saying that you need to have a regimented routine, because I think that can take the fun out of reading, right? But what I think having designated time for reading during the day does is it removes that question of when. It removes that uncertainty and it takes that excuse out of the equation. So maybe you want to read a few chapters when you wake up, to start the day. Maybe you want to do it before you go to bed, maybe on your commute, maybe while you're on your lunch break, because what are you most likely doing during those times? You're probably on your phone, right? And that leads to my second habit, which is trying to make reading your filler activity. I don't know about you, but usually when I have those little pockets of empty time during the day, my default is to just pick up my phone and start scrolling on social media. It's mindless, it's entertaining, it provides that instant dopamine hit. No wonder our screen time is so astronomical these days. So what I've tried to start doing in those moments is to reach for whatever reading material I have with me at the moment instead. And you'd be surprised at how much reading time that can add to your day. Now, the caveat to this is I know that there are some books that require you to be in a certain mood or require a certain level of concentration or focus that you may not have or you may not be capable of within those short periods of time. And that's why I think it's important to have different types of reading material in your rotation. It doesn't have to be a book, it can be a magazine, poems, literary journals, scientific journals, you name it, whatever reading material it is. It's fair game. So let's move on to trying to read more than one book at a time. Now, this is something that I used to be very opposed to. I thought it very counterintuitive to try to divide my attention between two books, for example. But it's not like you're going to have two books in your hands at the same time and move back and forth between them like this. Although if that's something that works for you, then by all means do it. What's been working for me is I usually try to alternate between one fiction and one nonfiction book at any given time. So to give you an example, I am currently reading Conversations on Love by Natasha Lunn on my Kindle, and that's my nonfiction pick. And my fiction pick is A Tree Grows in Brooklyn by Betty Smith. That way I have options, I'm able to alternate depending on my mood, depending on how I feel. So all it takes is figuring out what combination works best for you and experimenting with different types of reading material. And like I said, don't limit yourself to novels. Now, I think that one of the many causes of reading slumps and reading burnouts is sticking exclusively to one genre and never allowing yourself to explore outside of that, right? I do think that it's important to at least be open to expanding your horizons a bit. So as an example, I am not somebody who reads a lot of memoirs or biographies, but I remember being in a bookstore once and I came across Kitchen Confidential by Anthony Bourdain, and that book was not on my radar at all. It caught my eye, I picked it up, I read the first few pages and I was hooked, and that actually quickly became one of my favorite books. Sometimes we don't know exactly what it is that we require until we try something new. The worst case scenario is that you'll figure out that a certain genre or a certain author is just not for you, but that's a good thing as well because you're ultimately learning more about what you like. If you're wondering where you can get good book recommendations, I think there's so many different platforms out there, from BookTube to Bookstagram to Book Talk. There are literary journals, there are book blogs. I also made a video about 5 free websites that you can use to discover new books. I'm going to have that video linked somewhere here on the screen for you, so you can check that out if you're interested. Something else that I think is really important to do is to trust your reading instinct, and I think that is something that's multifold. And the first part of that, I think, is reading what you want to read. Now, I know that I just said that I enjoy using those platforms like BookTube, Bookstagram, BookTok, because they expose me to new and popular works that may not have otherwise been on my radar. But I think that it's very easy to find yourself on a book bandwagon when you're constantly being influenced by the social buzz and what everyone's talking about, what books are trendy, to the point where you start losing sight of what your reading taste is, because it just becomes an amalgamation of everyone else's. You also have to be mindful of those times where book criticisms and book reviews sort of tiptoe into book snobbery. There are spaces where people are judged for the types of books that they read, where it's about reading a certain amount of classics or reading a certain amount of books by Pulitzer Prize winning authors or books that have won this many awards. For me, that's not what reading is about. It's supposed to be fun, it's supposed to be enjoyable. So I think that as much as I'd encourage you to try something new, sometimes you just have to read what you like. Whether it's cheesy, sappy romance novels or obscure science fiction or that book on Goodreads that has 1 star that everyone hates but that you can't seem to put down. I think another aspect of trusting your reading instinct is reading at your own pace. Sometimes you'll see on platforms like BookTok, for example, people talking about the 50 books that they've read this past month. Meanwhile, you're sitting there side-eyeing yourself because you've barely gotten through one. I think it comes back to that comparison game that we like to play, which can be very counterproductive, right? You're not obligated to do any challenges. You're not obligated to finish a certain amount of books within a certain time frame. If those are things that motivate you to read, if those are things that maybe get you out of a slump, then by all means go ahead, do that challenge, set that goal for yourself. But ultimately, I think it's important to ensure that you're doing it for you, and that you're not doing it to prove a point to anybody. The final aspect of trusting your reading instinct that I like to talk about is sometimes you just have to put a book down when you're not enjoying it. You just have to set it aside. I used to be very much against DNFing, and I realized that there was not exactly a substantial or meaningful reason for it. I think part of it was just that I didn't want to be somebody who started something and didn't finish it. But I realized that with reading, I'm fine doing that. Because 1, it means that I'm not wasting time on a book that I'm not enjoying. And 2, it means that I'm freeing up more time to discover books that I'm actually gonna like. There are some books, of course, that maybe just start off slowly. Maybe the writing style is not one that you're used to, and I think sometimes you just have to give it a while, give yourself some time to get used to it. But it could be that maybe this isn't the time that you're meant to read that book. Maybe you need to have certain experiences that will help you to appreciate it more. Maybe the book will find you and come back to you at a different point in your life. Or maybe the book just isn't for you, right? And I think that trusting your reading instinct can mean being open to any of those possibilities. So let's talk about trying different formats of reading. I mentioned in my Kindle review video, which I will also have linked for you on the screen here if you're interested in that. I mentioned in that video that if I didn't have a physical book in my hand, if I wasn't able to hold it and, sort of feel and turn the pages, then I didn't want it. And when I finally gave in and got a Kindle, I wish that I had done it much sooner. I don't think I'll ever fully give up physical books, but I do think that e-reading has brought a lot of benefits to my reading practice. I can take many books around with me at a time. I have different options, wherever I go. I've also found that there's this interesting phenomenon, and let me know if you've also experienced this, where I tend to get through books faster when I'm reading on my Kindle. Not that speed matters, but I think what happens is that because you're only looking at that one page and you're not being constantly distracted by, what's on the next page as you might be with a physical book, and you're not constantly thinking about maybe how thick the book is, then you're able to focus better and get through the reading a lot faster. Now, of course, apart from ebooks, you also have audiobooks. I am not someone who listens to audiobooks. That's not my preferred way of enjoying a book, but I do encourage you to experiment with as different formats as you can. Don't let anyone tell you that one format or one method is superior to the other, or that one somehow makes you a better reader than the other. I would also encourage you to track your reading. Now, you're probably familiar with platforms like Storygraph and Goodreads, where you can get personalized recommendations, you can track the books that you've read, and you can connect with other readers. I've always used Goodreads. Storygraph has been a recent addition. I'd say maybe within the past 2 years or so, I've started using Storygraph, and I found that I'm actually preferring it. I think that it just does a better job of giving you insights about your reading. One thing I will say is that I don't use the social features of these platforms very much. I mean, I do look at what other people are reading from time to time, and I do look at book reviews and ratings from time to time as well. But I try not to let those ratings influence whether or not I'm going to pick up a book too much. I mean, of course, sometimes you'll have overwhelmingly negative criticism and reviews, and there's often a reason for that. But there have definitely been times where I've not picked up a book just because I read a few bad reviews, and that's not the kind of reader that I like to be. And I've also found that it's difficult for me to rate books on a scale. It's difficult for me to quantify how much I enjoyed a book on a scale of 1 to 5, for example. I think it comes back to reminding yourself that not everyone reads for the same reason, not everyone reads with the same eyes. Where I might find flowery and descriptive language captivating and appealing, you might not appreciate that as much if you're somebody who reads mainly for plot. So I think it's just important to keep that in mind. So we're coming down to the final 2 points, and the penultimate habit I'd like to talk about is interacting with your books. And what does that mean? Well, one of my favorite YouTubers, Kat from Kat's Field Notes, recently said in one of her videos, you should love and live in the books that evoke the most in you, and that really resonated with me. I think one of the main reasons that I love used books as much as I do is because I get to see the lives that they've lived before they've gotten into my hands, largely through marginalia. So those notes in the margins, those passages that are highlighted or underlined. And I think that highlighting, that note-taking, that, jotting things down and underlining, I think that is you being in conversation with the author, is you being in conversation with the characters, is you being in conversation with yourself, right? Usually I'll just have a pen or pencil with me as I read, and I will highlight or underline sentences that resonate with me. Sometimes I'll highlight a concept that maybe I agree or disagree with. I'll say why, I'll say what it is that I need to learn more about. And I also like to use these tabs to bookmark those sections or chapters that I want to remember. And I do this especially with anthologies so that I can quickly come back to the poems that I enjoy the most. And then of course, if I'm on my Kindle, I will use the very handy highlight and notes features there. I think that doing this helps you to be a more engaged reader. You're not just sitting there taking words in passively. When I started doing this, when I started to take the time to reflect and be more engaged while I was reading, and even after, reading a book and putting it down, I realized that I was able to make better connections between different books and different ideas. I was able to summarize my thoughts better, and I was also able to do a book more justice when I was recommending it to friends, for example. And then it doesn't have to stop there. I think you can go even further by having a reading journal. There's actually a really cool Notion template created by Ali Abdal where you answer these questions like, what was the book about? What are some of the main themes? What are some of the quotes that you enjoyed? And who would you recommend it to? And even though I've stopped doing that because it became a little repetitive for me after each and every book, I do still try to keep those questions in mind. I try to make a mental note of those questions as I'm reading. Now, finally, let's talk about allowing yourself to take breaks and to embrace reading slumps. If you're a reader, then you're probably familiar with those periods of time where you will just not feel pulled to any book. You feel a bit burnt out, a bit uninspired, and that's what we call a reading slump. I used to feel so much guilt around being in a reading slump, constantly telling myself, you should be reading right now. And then I'd force myself to read something and that wouldn't end well. So what I started doing is I started to allow myself to experience those slumps without guilt and to take a step back from reading every once in a while. Reading is an activity that, like I said, should engage you, right? You're using your imagination to envision a story, to envision maybe how you might put certain principles or concepts that you learn from a book into practice. And so it's normal for those creative and imaginative muscles to become weary over time. And you just have to be okay with that. You have to be okay with taking a step back, taking a break. And what I found by taking those breaks is that I give myself time to synthesize new ideas that I may have gotten from books in the past, to reevaluate what I'm enjoying about my reading practice at the moment and what is missing from it, to ask myself what kinds of books I may want to add to to my rotation and what kinds of books I may need to step away from. And I think you'll find that if reading truly is something that's important to you, if it's something that you value, you're always going to be able to come back to it. And more than likely, you'll be able to come back to it with fresh eyes, a new perspective, and a renewed appetite and appreciation for it. So those are some of the main reading habits that I've adopted and that have stuck with me over the years. I know that this was a bit of a longer one, but if you made it to the end of this video, thank you so much for sticking with me. If you enjoyed the video, remember to leave a like and subscribe, comment and let me know what you think about these habits and if there are any that have been useful for you that you'd recommend to me. As always, I'd love to hear from you down in the comment section. So take good care and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.